Welcome back, guys. We are working our way through period 2 of the APUSH curriculum. We are already up to topic 2.6, almost there. The topic today is slavery in the British colonies. So let's take a look. So we're going to get two guiding questions in this topic. The first one is, what were the causes and effects of slavery in the British colonies? Causes and effects. Here we go. Let's look at the causes first. A little bit of context before we get into the causes specifically. Even though we associate, say, South Carolina or Virginia with colonial slavery, there were slaves in all of the colonies. Okay, even Pennsylvania, which had originally been very anti-slavery, had some. All right, if you look at the graph, you can see that large numbers in places like Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and then very small numbers in colonies like New Hampshire, Massachusetts. So the further north you went, the lower the number typically was. What's interesting about this is 1770, by the way. The population number is important, but I think what's even more important is the percentage of the overall population. So, in other words, 99% of people in New Hampshire were not enslaved. Okay, but in South Carolina, 61% of the people were enslaved. So, the more than 50%, or the majority of people in South Carolina, were enslaved. As proof that this did take place not just in the South, we can look at the example of Newport, Rhode Island. Up here, you can see it's a major stopping point on the triangular trade routes that we looked at in a previous section. Shipbuilding, you name it, things were happening. And so, even though the number of slaves in Rhode Island and New England as a whole were relatively small, they still did benefit from slavery. They still had a role in the slave trade. So, why not a lot of slaves in New England? A couple reasons. One is just climate and soil. It was not a good place for growing cash crop. You're not going to see sugar plantations, rice plantations, tobacco plantations. You're not going to see any of that stuff in New England. That was down here in the more warmer, wetter, almost tropical climates of the South. Also, the settlement patterns were different. In New England, you had lots of families coming over. You didn't, unlike in the Virginia area, where you had a lot of individuals coming over, and they saw Virginia more as a business opportunity than it was a refuge, like New England was for not a lot of New England settlers. However, whether you're in the North or the South, in the early days of slavery, you would see even in areas where you wouldn't have a lot of slaves, in a general area, you would have a number in those port cities. So whether that's Newport, whether that's Jamestown itself, or Savannah, Georgia, you would have significant numbers of enslaved people. Now, we've looked at some of the causes of slavery in English colonies. Now we're going to look at another one that is an indirect but very important reason why slavery is going to grow in the English colony. And it's called Bacon's Rebellion. So, the situation is, by the 1670s, Jamestown has been around now for decades. And the indentured servant program was running into some problems, because originally the way indentured servitude would work is you would work your contract, say again 5, 6, 7 years, and then when you got out, as part of the contract, you would also get land. So you've done your labor, now your reward is you're free and you get land. Well, with time evolving, what's happening is a lot of the good land has already been taken, and so a lot of the indentures didn't require the indenture holder to give land away for the indentured servant. So anyways, what I'm trying to say is you would have a lot of former indentured servants who tend to be poor, tend to be landless, tend to have not a lot of political voice. They're resentful of the elite, of the people they see as taking advantage of them, and this is going to lead to a rebellion. We call it Bacon's Rebellion, named for Nathaniel Bacon. And Nathaniel Bacon spoke on behalf of these disaffected frontiersmen primarily, who were living out in hostile lands right on the edge of where European civilization stopped and Native Americans began. They were vulnerable to attacks, and there were raids on a lot of their areas, and the governor of Virginia, a man named Berkeley, didn't seem to be doing a whole lot to protect those settlers. And one of the reasons he wasn't doing a lot to protect them was he did not like the idea of antagonizing the Native Americans, because that would then get in the way of the trade being done with Indians. So for a lot of these young, landless or poor frontiersmen, they felt as if the government of Virginia favored their potential wealth with the Native Americans more than they did the safety of those settlers. And so they rose up in rebellion. Not only did they rebel against the government, they also went on kind of the warpath to take on Native Americans, who they saw as sort of like the number one danger. And so Indians were killed in large numbers. Jamestown itself was set on fire by these rebels. And then Nathaniel Bacon died of dysentery. And after that point, the rebellion begins to kind of fizzle out. And in the end, Bacon's rebellion fails. Okay, they don't take over Virginia or anything like that. But the long-term effect of this is that if you are a wealthy planter in Virginia, you saw indentured servants as potential ticking time bombs, as people who could rise up and attack you. And you don't like that, so you don't trust that system anymore. Instead, what you are going to trust is African slaves. You're going to purchase people from across the ocean, bring them over, and these slaves will not have any notion of having any freedom. They won't have any reason to think they have rights or freedom, unlike the indentured servants. And so therefore they'll be a more docile workforce. That was the theory going in the minds of wealthy planters. So when you think of the Bacon's Rebellion, remember, it's a major stepping stone to the expansion of slavery, because it turned a lot of wealthy planters against the indentured servant system. All right, so let's look at some effects of British slavery in the New World. And the first one is going to take us down to the West Indies, down in the Caribbean, to look at those sugar plantations, which required just a very extensive labor force, and the work was brutal. And the British decided that they had to bring lots and lots of laborers over from Africa. And a lot of those islands, the British found themselves a minority. There were fewer British than there were slaves. And so the British felt kind of nervous about this, and they decided they had to come up with some sort of legal system to control the huge slave population on these islands. And so they came up with these things called slave codes. And probably the most famous of these would be the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. It was so influential that other British colonies, like say the Carolinas, adopted their own version of this code. And this is something that's going to evolve. We're going to come back and talk about slave codes, which will later turn into black codes, which will later turn into Jim Crow. I mean, there's kind of a sequence of events, so we will come back to this topic later. But what is actually in the slave code that we need to remember? And the number one thing I want you to remember about the slave codes is that it set a precedent of establishing something called chattel slavery. And you're thinking, what is chattel slavery? Well, chattel slavery is different from just some other version of slavery, in the sense that as an enslaved person, your children will also be enslaved, and their children will also be enslaved. That's called chattel slavery. This is different than, say, enslaving a person and then their kids are free, or there's a time frame on your slavery. Well, it ends at a certain time, and this is basically in perpetuity. This is a slavery that cannot be escaped outside of some other legal abolition. This is it. I mean, this chattel slavery is for the long term, your kids, their kids, and so forth. All right, let's look at some slave resistance. Talk about how the slaves could have resisted. In fact, that is our second guiding question. How did African slaves respond to slavery? We're going to look at overt and then covert means of resistance. Overt means out in the open, right? This is using violence. This is refusing to work. This is running away. This is acting in self-harm so that you can't work and you deny your labor to the slave owner. And this could even, in fact, go as far as taking your own life, to deny your life to someone else's benefit. Why would you want to work your whole life for this person who's never going to give you anything other than continued slavery? So that's overt. That's open resistance, easy to see, very dramatic. And then there's something we call covert resistance. Covert means secretive, or at least not open. It's kind of hidden. And this was a type of resistance that almost all slaves could participate. So if you weren't physically able to fight back, well, you could do other things. For one, you could keep your culture going. So even though everyone else around you is speaking English, if you were from Africa, or your parents were from Africa, or their grandparents were from Africa, you could keep some of that language and religion alive by practicing it secretly. You could steal food. You could steal goods from the slave owner. You could run away. You could assist runaways. You could maintain a stable family. So simply having a family and loving that family and keeping those ties strong was in fact a form of resistance, because what it is establishing and reinforcing your humanity, which is not being respected through those slave codes. So you're facing inhumanity by being humane. All right, so that was our look at slave resistance and also the cause and effects of British slavery. This, obviously, the topic of slavery is something we're going to come back and talk a lot more about this semester, but there it is. In our next video, we're going to finish up period 2, and before you know it, we'll be right into the Revolution.